There is a town in McDowell County, West Virginia, that does not appear on any modern map. The people who worked there called it the place where the ground gave way, where the shaft opened up, and where the men who went down in September of 1882 did not come back up the same way they went in. What they found at the bottom of that shaft has never been fully explained. The official record says it was a natural gas pocket, an underground cavern collapse, equipment failure. The company report filed with the Kanawha County office lists the incident as a mining accident, resulting in property loss and the sealing of shafts 7, 8, and 9 in the flat-top coal seam. 3 shafts sealed permanently in the same week, with no survivors interviewed publicly, with the water pumps reversed and the drainage channels redirected, flooding those tunnels from the inside out within 72 hours of the discovery. You do not flood 3 mine shafts in 72 hours because of a gas pocket. You flood 3 mine shafts in 72 hours because you found something you need to make disappear. West Virginia sits on one of the oldest geological formations in the eastern United States. The Appalachian coalfields run through a bedrock that geologists date to the Carboniferous period, roughly 300 million years ago, but that bedrock sits on top of something far older, something that predates the coal, something that predates the trees that became the coal. The tunneling work done in the 1870s and 1880s was not just extraction work. It was, in some cases, the first time human hands had broken through into chambers that had been sealed for an incomprehensible span of time. And in 1882, in a seam running beneath the ridge they called Black Wolf Mountain, those hands broke through into something they were not prepared for. The Pocahontas coalfield opened commercially in 1883, 1 year after the incident at the Flat Top Seam. The industrialists who had been financing exploratory drilling in that region for the better part of a decade made a decision in late 1882 to redirect their operation, to move the primary extraction point 17 miles northeast. To leave the Flat Top Seam untouched, they walked away from a proven coal deposit of enormous value. They flooded it, sealed it, and started over somewhere else. You do not walk away from money like that without a reason. There are 3 accounts that survived from the men who were working near shafts 7, 8, and 9 in the days before the flooding. 2 of them were preserved in private letters that ended up in a collection donated to the West Virginia State Archives in 1941. The 3rd was recorded in a deposition taken in connection with a property dispute in 1897, 15 years after the event, in which a man named Elias Drummond gave testimony about what he had seen while working the night shift on September the 14th. Drummond was 61 years old at the time of the deposition. He had worked the southern Appalachian coalfields for 30 years. He was not a man given to exaggeration. The attorney taking his deposition noted in a margin annotation that Drummond was considered a reliable witness and that his account was consistent across 2 separate interviews. Drummond testified that on the night of September the 14th, the drill team working shaft 9 broke through a wall at a depth of approximately 240 feet. He described hearing a sound he could not name, not a gas hiss, not a structural collapse, something resonant, something that came up through the shaft floor and into the walls and into his chest before he could identify it as sound at all. He said the men at the bottom of the shaft went quiet. Then the foreman sent the signal up, 1 pull on the rope, then 2, then the signal that meant everyone surface immediately and do not stop for equipment. By the time Drummond reached the surface, 4 men were already there. He said 2 of them were sitting on the ground and would not stand up. He said the foreman, a man named Caulfield, whose first name he could not remember, stood at the shaft entrance with a lantern and would not allow anyone back down, would not speak, would not answer questions about what was below. Caulfield left the site that same night. Drummond never saw him again. The 2 surviving letters from the archive tell a different part of the story. One was written by a man identified only by the initials R.H., addressed to his brother in Roanoke, Virginia, dated September the 19th, 1882, 5 days after the Shaft 9 breakthrough. R.H. writes that the management has called all workers to a meeting and told them the southern shafts are being closed due to instability. He writes that no one believes this explanation. He writes that the men who went down before the closing were saying the passage had opened into a room that should not be there. Not a cavern, not a natural chamber, a room. He writes that the room was large enough that the lantern light could not reach the far wall. He writes that the floor of the room was flat and level, not the irregular surface of a natural geological formation, but flat in a way that stopped the men cold, because a flat floor at 240 feet in undisturbed Carboniferous bedrock means something was down there before the coal, before the mountain, before whatever timeline the men of 1882 were using to understand the age of the world. The second letter was written by a woman named Margaret Coles to her sister in Charleston. Margaret Coles was the wife of one of the engineers contracted to oversee the flooding operation. She writes that her husband came home on the third night and could not sleep and would not eat and sat at the kitchen table until dawn. She writes that when she asked him what was wrong, he told her the pumps were fighting the water, that the water was going down and then coming back up, that something in the chamber was interfering with the drainage. She writes that her husband believed the water was being displaced, that the volume entering the system was not accounting for the volume that should be filling the space below. Something was taking up room in that chamber that the water could not fill. She writes that the company brought in a second team and accelerated the flooding, that by the end of the 72-hour period the shafts were sealed with timber and concrete, and that her husband was told his contract was complete. He was paid twice his contracted rate and asked to sign a document she did not see. There is a category of evidence in the Tartarian record that researchers have come to call displacement anomalies. The pattern appears in flooding operations, in demolition records, and in mine sealing reports from the late 19th century with a regularity that the mainstream historical record has never addressed. When workers encounter a sealed underground chamber in the eastern United States during this specific window of industrial expansion, and when that chamber is subsequently flooded or filled, the volume calculations do not add up. There is always less space than there should be. The water fills faster than expected, or the water fights the fill in ways consistent with a partial obstruction of significant mass. West Virginia's coalfield geology is unusually complex even by Appalachian standards. The mountain ridges in the southern part of the state are among the oldest surface formations in the world. The coal seams run through rock that has not been disturbed since before human civilization was supposed to exist in this hemisphere. The steam drill changed everything. Before the steam drill, shaft excavation was limited by human labor. After the steam drill, the shafts went deeper, faster, and with less warning before breakthrough. The men of the 1882 generation were the first to reach the levels where something had been placed or had lived or had built, below the formation layer that earlier centuries of surface existence had never breached. And the people who owned the drills understood what was being found. The flooding operations were not panicked responses. They were organized, they were rapid, they were well funded. Someone had a protocol, someone had thought about what to do before it happened. In 1879, 3 years before the Flat Top incident, a mound excavation was conducted in Kanawha County by a team affiliated with the Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of Ethnology. The report, published in the Bureau's annual report for 1881, notes the discovery of skeletal remains at multiple depth levels. The upper levels contained remains consistent with Adena cultural practices. The lower levels, below what the report calls the cultural deposit layer, contained remains of a different character entirely. A femur of 31 inches, a skull with an orbital diameter inconsistent with the comparative samples available at the time. The report recommends further study. The further study was apparently never published. The Smithsonian catalog number assigned to the Kanawha County materials does not appear in any subsequent publication. The materials went into the building and did not come back out. There is a document in the Library of Congress, partially digitized as part of the American Memory Collection. It is a survey report filed in 1886 by a geological assessor named Thomas Whitfield, contracted to evaluate mineral rights in McDowell and Mercer counties. The report is routine in most respects until page 37, where Whitfield describes a feature he cannot classify. A sealed shaft not on his survey list, a concrete cap of unusual thickness, 14 to 18 inches of poured concrete over a shaft of approximately 9 feet in diameter. Ground around the cap showing subsidence in a circular pattern extending outward for approximately 30 feet, consistent with a very large void beneath the surface. He notes that his survey instruments showed a gravitational anomaly over this location. This is not a word used loosely by a geological surveyor in 1886. Whitfield knew that a gravitational reading inconsistent with the surrounding profile meant either an extremely dense material below or an extremely empty space below. Given the subsidence pattern, the empty space interpretation was the more consistent one. He recommends the site be evaluated by a team with appropriate equipment. There is no record of a follow-up survey. The land holdings company that commissioned his work dissolved in 1889. The chamber below shaft 9, if the account of R.H. and the testimony of Elias Drummond and the engineering notes relayed through Margaret Coles are taken together as a consistent record, was a room. Flat-floored. Large enough to exceed the reach of 19th century lantern light. Containing something of sufficient mass to interfere with water displacement during a forced flooding operation conducted with industrial pumps. Located below undisturbed Carboniferous era bedrock at 240 feet, showing a gravitational signature consistent with a very large void or a very dense partial fill. The 1882 that falls within the window researchers have identified as the Great Erasure period. The 2 decades span from approximately 1870 to 1890, during which the industrial infrastructure of North America was being built at speed, during which the ground was being broken in thousands of locations simultaneously, during which a generation of workers encountered the residue of an earlier civilization, at a scale the historical record was systematically adjusted to exclude. The protocol was not a single policy from a single source. It was a distributed understanding among the people with access to capital and institutional authority that certain categories of discovery required a certain category of response. Fill it, flood it, seal it, move on, pay the workers, lose the records. The mountain is still there. Black Wolf Mountain, or what the maps now call that ridge, is still there. The shafts are still below. The concrete caps, if Whitfield's survey is accurate, are still there. The chamber is still there. 240 feet below a ridge in McDowell County that the coal companies abandoned 140 years ago for reasons they never fully explained. The coal fields of southern West Virginia are not finished telling their story. They were simply told to stop. There are people living in McDowell County today whose grandparents worked the coal fields in the 1880s. There are families in that county who have passed down stories for 4 generations about the southern shafts and the things that came up from below, and the men who would never talk about what they had seen. These stories do not appear in any academic history of the West Virginia coal industry. They do not appear in the company archives, most of which were destroyed in a fire in 1931. They live in kitchen tables and front porch conversations, and in the particular way that old men in certain parts of that county go quiet when the ground beneath a certain ridge comes up in conversation. The Norfolk and Western Railway completed its line into the Pocahontas coalfield in 1883. The first coal shipment left the new operation in March of that year. Within 5 years, the Pocahontas field was producing more coal per annum than any comparable operation in the eastern United States. The flat top seam, 17 miles southwest, sat flooded and sealed, a deposit of comparable quality, abandoned in favor of a development requiring new rail infrastructure. The economics do not make sense unless the flat top abandonment was not a choice at all. The water they pumped in had to go somewhere. The hydrology of the flat top seam drainage was studied in the context of acid mine drainage remediation in the 1990s. The remediation studies note unusual drainage patterns in the McDowell County portion of the flat top seam. Water moving in directions inconsistent with the local gradient. Drainage channels that do not follow the expected subsurface topography. The engineers attributed these anomalies to complex fracture networks. They noted them. They did not resolve them. Water moving around something. There is one final piece of the record most accounts of this incident have not addressed. In the summer of 1901, 19 years after the flat top sealing, a prospector named Abel Marsh applied for a mineral rights survey of a parcel in the Black Wolf Ridge area. The application was denied by the McDowell County Land Office. The denial letter, preserved in the county records on microfilm, gives the reason as prior claim restriction. Marsh appealed. The appeal was dismissed without explanation. Marsh wrote to his congressman, recorded in the congressional correspondence files for the West Virginia district, in which he described being told by a county official that the parcel was under a federal reservation and could not be surveyed or developed under any civilian permit. Marsh wrote that when he asked what federal reservation applied to a private coalfield in McDowell County, he was told that he should not ask that question again. A federal reservation on a flooded coalfield shaft in 1901. at a time when federal land restrictions in that part of West Virginia were virtually non-existent for mineral survey purposes. Whatever was in that chamber, someone in the federal government knew it was there, and someone had decided it needed to stay exactly where the coal company had left it. The shaft is sealed, the records are gone, the men are long dead, and the ridge above it still stands, keeping its silence in the way that mountains do when they have been asked to keep secrets that the people on the surface have never found the courage to dig back up.